In the early hours of December 27th, 1941, a heavy shroud of winter mist clung low to the icy waters off the coast of Norway. The sea, black as coal beneath the pre-dawn sky, was broken only by the faint phosphorescent trails left in the wake of a formation of British naval vessels. Engines throbbed quietly beneath deck plates, men on board huddled in silence, breath forming wisps in the air, eyes fixed on the dark horizon ahead. The chill was penetrating, more than just cold. It was the kind that gnawed at bones and stiffened fingers around rifle barrels. Yet inside each man burned a fire far stronger than the Arctic winds. This was no ordinary patrol. This was Operation Archery, one of the first major combined arms raids of the war, and certainly among the boldest yet attempted. A joint force of British commandos, Norwegian exiles, and Royal Navy ships was en route to a daring assault on Nazi-occupied territory. Their target, the remote island of Måløy and the nearby town of Måløy, lying on Norway's rugged western coast. Though these places were small in size, they held outsized importance in the war's northern theater. Since the invasion of Norway in April 1940, German forces had turned the long, fjord-laced Norwegian coastline into a vital component of Hitler's northern flank. It offered strategic access to the North Atlantic, protection for vital shipping lanes, and, perhaps most crucially, control over Norway's rich natural resources, including iron ore from Sweden and fish stocks, critical to the German war effort. Måløy, in particular, had become a hub of enemy operations, bristling with defenses. The Germans had fortified the area heavily, recognizing its importance as a communications node and logistics waypoint. Gun emplacements, bunkers, radar installations, and garrisons filled the hills and fjord inlets, creating what many feared was an impregnable outpost. Yet the Allies had a plan, a bold and calculated strike that would not only disrupt German operations, but also send a message: the Reich was not invincible, and its northern strongholds were vulnerable. Planning for the raid had begun in earnest weeks earlier. British intelligence had gathered enough information to indicate that German shipping traffic through the region was increasing. Axis troops were using Måløy as a supply depot, repair point, and rest area. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, an early proponent of what he termed the butcher and bolt philosophy of special operations, approved the plan enthusiastically. The idea was as audacious as it was risky: a surprise amphibious assault carried out in the heart of winter on a town surrounded by mountains and entrenched defenders. To lead the operation, the Allies turned to the newly formed No. 3 Commando unit, a group of highly trained volunteers selected for their fitness, marksmanship, and nerve. These men had undergone rigorous training in Scotland and Wales, learning the art of silent killing, demolition, amphibious assault, and mountain warfare. Many of them were veterans of earlier skirmishes in North Africa or the Mediterranean. They were supported by Norwegian troops from the exile forces based in Britain, men who knew the landscape, the language, and the weather with the intimate familiarity of those fighting for their homeland. The naval contingent supporting the raid included destroyers, cruisers, and smaller craft, all coordinated under the command of Rear Admiral Harold Burrow. The Royal Air Force, too, would play a vital role, tasked with launching diversionary attacks on German airfields and infrastructure elsewhere in Norway to confuse and delay enemy reinforcements. As the task force closed in on Måløy in the pre-dawn darkness, every man aboard knew the stakes. This was no training exercise. The Germans were seasoned, heavily armed, and unlikely to surrender easily. But the commandos had trained for precisely this moment. Morale was high, bolstered by a grim sense of purpose and unity of mission. The sea rolled beneath the landing craft, as final briefings were whispered among the officers. Weapons were checked and rechecked, demolition charges were fitted. Each man carried a carefully prepared kit: extra ammunition, grenades, knives, cold weather gear. Some had even written letters to loved ones the night before, just in case. Above, the sky was beginning to lighten, the first faint glow of daybreak touching the peaks of the snow-covered cliffs. Then, through the mist, the shape of land emerged. Jagged rocks and the steep slopes of Vågsøy loomed ahead. The harbor at Måløy, nestled in a fjord, was still asleep, its town square and buildings silent beneath the rising dawn. But that silence would not last. Within minutes, the warships would begin their bombardment. The commandos would hit the beaches. The guns of Måløy would speak, and so would the guns of Britain's finest raiders. The stillness would be shattered by the scream of shells, the crack of rifle fire, and the thunder of boots as men leapt into history. Operation Archery had begun. Since April 9th, 1940, when German forces launched Operation Weserübung and invaded Norway, the Scandinavian kingdom had become an unwilling fortress for Hitler's war machine. What had once been a neutral land of mountains, fjords, and fishing villages was now a militarized outpost, an integral link in the Nazi chain of Atlantic defense. The occupation had been swift and brutal. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht controlled the Norwegian coast, its ports, and its key transport arteries. The Norwegian government had fled into exile in London, while inside the country, resistance movements were beginning to stir quietly under the boot of German oppression. Germany's interest in Norway went far beyond simple geography. The coastline, jagged and intricate with its deep fjords and sheltered inlets, offered the Kriegsmarine prime staging areas for U-boats, warships, and patrol vessels. From these hidden redoubts, the Germans could strike at Allied convoys crossing the North Atlantic, lifelines of food, fuel, and war materiel desperately needed by Britain. The terrain itself, harsh and remote, made any counterattack difficult and costly, while the northern ports ensured year-round access to the iron ore shipments from neutral Sweden, essential for Hitler's war industries. As part of this occupation, the Nazis rapidly fortified Norway's long coastline, building what would become known as the northern extension of the Atlantic Wall. Radar stations, concrete bunkers, anti-aircraft batteries, and gun emplacements were constructed along the cliffs. German soldiers, many from elite mountain and naval units, were stationed in small towns and villages, turning once quiet fishing communities into armed garrisons. One such town was Måløy, perched on the southern edge of the island of Vågsøy in western Norway. It was small, picturesque, and surrounded by hills, but to German planners, Måløy was more than just a dot on the map. The town held strategic and industrial value far beyond its size. It was home to a number of fish oil factories, seemingly innocuous facilities that, under closer scrutiny, revealed themselves to be critical nodes in the Nazi war economy. Fish oil, extracted from the massive harvests of herring and other species that abounded in Norwegian waters, had peacetime uses in agriculture, lighting, and nutrition. But under the Reich, its most critical use was in the manufacture of nitroglycerin and other explosives. When chemically treated, the fatty acids from fish oil became a vital feedstock for the German munitions industry. Every ton of fish processed in Måløy translated into bullets, shells, and bombs. As such, the town's factories were effectively weapons plants in disguise, producing fuel not for machines but for destruction. The British High Command knew this. Intelligence reports from Norwegian resistance fighters and aerial reconnaissance confirmed the increasing output of these factories and their importance to the Nazi war effort. More troubling still was the growing presence of German troops and military equipment in the area. Not only were the fish oil plants running at full capacity, but Måløy had become a supply hub and communications center for the broader region, coordinating shipments and maintaining the logistical flow to outlying outposts along the coast. To the strategists in London, this presented an opportunity and a challenge. Disrupting the production of explosives at Måløy would not only inflict a direct blow on the German war machine, but also achieve something far more strategic. It would force the Nazis to react. The hope was that a successful raid on such a vital target would compel Hitler to reinforce Norway, shifting troops, artillery, and aircraft away from other fronts, particularly from the Eastern Front and the looming campaigns in Western Europe. In essence, the Allies aimed to provoke a strategic overreaction, to stretch the Wehrmacht's resources thin and throw sand into the gears of German planning. Moreover, such a raid would serve a symbolic purpose. Norway had suffered in silence for nearly 2 years. A sudden, devastating Allied strike in the heart of occupied territory would remind the Norwegian people and the world that the fight was far from over. It would embolden resistance networks, disrupt enemy communications, and shake German morale. Even a brief but successful assault would ripple across the German command structure like a thunderclap in a still forest. The risks, however, were considerable. Måløy was not undefended. German troops had established defensive positions in and around the town. Machine gun nests covered the harbor approaches, anti-aircraft guns dotted the hills, and local fjords allowed for rapid deployment of reinforcements from neighboring areas. Any attack would need to be swift, overwhelming, and precise. There would be no second chance. For this reason, the planners behind Operation Archery chose a combination of commandos and naval forces capable of delivering a coordinated punch. The attack would need to hit multiple targets simultaneously: the factories, the barracks, the communications center, and any enemy vessels moored in the harbor. Buildings would have to be demolished with explosive charges, supplies destroyed, prisoners captured for intelligence. And then just as quickly, the raiders would need to withdraw before German air support or reinforcements could arrive. It was, in short, a surgical strike with strategic consequences. As the Royal Navy ships slipped through the cold waters toward Måløy that December morning, everyone aboard knew what was at stake. This was more than a raid. It was a signal to the Germans, to the Norwegians, and to history that no part of the Nazi Empire was safe, and that even the frozen coasts of Norway could feel the hammer of Allied resolve. Operation Archery was a striking example of Allied coordination in the early years of the Second World War. A meticulously orchestrated operation that drew together multiple branches of the British military and their Norwegian allies in a single daring assault. Unlike the large-scale invasions that would come later in the war, this was a precision raid, compact, rapid, and immensely risky. It brought together the finest elements of Britain's burgeoning commando forces, the muscle of the Royal Navy, the reach of the Royal Air Force, and the irreplaceable local knowledge and courage of the Norwegian resistance. Each component had its part to play in what was to be one of the most celebrated commando operations of the entire war. At the heart of the ground assault was Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford-Slater, a veteran officer and one of the founding figures of Britain's commando units. By December 1941, Durnford-Slater had earned a reputation for aggressive leadership and steely resolve. He commanded No. 3rd Commando, the corps unit spearheading the attack on Måløy. These were not regular infantrymen. Trained in the Highlands of Scotland under grueling conditions, the commandos were handpicked for their fitness, discipline, and audacity. They were specialists in amphibious assault, sabotage, demolitions, and irregular warfare. Their role in Operation Archery would test every facet of their training. Supporting No. 3rd Commando were detachments from No. 2, No. 4, and No. 6 Commandos, each bringing additional manpower and tactical flexibility. Among them were seasoned raiders, many of whom had participated in earlier operations in Norway and the Channel Islands. Together, these men formed a tightly knit assault force, about 570 strong, prepared to fight in some of the harshest winter conditions on Earth. Crucially, the operation also included a Norwegian unit that held both symbolic and practical importance. This was the Norwegian Independent Company 1, sometimes referred to as Company Linge, after its commander, Captain Martin Linge. Linge was a distinguished actor before the war, but when his homeland was invaded, he turned to soldiering with a fervor that inspired those around him. He had been instrumental in recruiting Norwegians living in exile to join the fight for their country's liberation. His presence on the battlefield was a beacon to both Norwegians under occupation and to Allied troops, proof that Norway had not surrendered in spirit. The seaborne assault was backed by formidable naval power. HMS Kenya, a Crown Colony-class light cruiser, served as the command ship and the heavy hitter for shore bombardment. Armed with 6-inch guns, she would unleash a barrage on German fortifications in Måløy, targeting gun emplacements, barracks, and suspected headquarters buildings. Alongside her were 4 Royal Navy destroyers, HMS Onslow, Oribi, Offa, and Chiddingfold. These swift, versatile ships provided close support, covering fire for the landing craft and rapid extraction capability in case of a tactical withdrawal. Above them, the Royal Air Force played its crucial part. Bristol Blenheim bombers flew in ahead of the landings to soften German positions and disrupt communications, while fighter bombers, likely including Hurricanes and Beaufighters, swept the skies, strafing enemy positions and providing cover against any Luftwaffe response. Air superiority was vital to the operation's timing and secrecy. The fog of war, literally and figuratively, would be manipulated by the Allies to catch the German garrison off guard. The landings in the early morning of December 27th were met, at first, with only scattered resistance. The commandos came ashore swiftly, establishing beachheads and pushing inland under the cover of naval guns and aerial attacks. Confidence was high, and early signs pointed to a swift and overwhelming success. But then the situation changed, drastically. Unbeknownst to Allied intelligence, a seasoned unit of German Gebirgsjäger, elite mountain troops, was present, in the town on leave. These men were no green recruits. Many had fought in the mountains of Yugoslavia, the Carpathians, and most recently on the bitter Eastern Front against the Red Army. They were battle-hardened, physically resilient, and accustomed to operating in difficult terrain. Their sudden presence in Måløy transformed what was supposed to be a clean commando raid into a vicious, grinding street battle. As the commandos advanced into the heart of Måløy, they found themselves engaged in ferocious house-to-house combat. Narrow alleys, fortified buildings, and hidden firing positions turned every street corner into a potential death trap. German troops, some entrenched in basements, others firing from upper-story windows, offered fierce resistance. The roar of gunfire echoed off the stone buildings, explosions shattered glass, and the acrid stench of smoke and cordite filled the icy air. Close-quarters combat is among the most terrifying experiences a soldier can face. There is no distance, no cover, no reprieve, only speed, precision, and ferocity. In Måløy, British commandos fought room to room, clearing houses with grenades and submachine guns. Many used their Fairbairn Sykes fighting knives when the fighting grew too close for firearms. It was brutal, personal, and exhausting. For several hours, the town became a maelstrom of chaos and blood. Tragically, among the fallen was Captain Martin Linge. He was leading his Norwegian troops in an assault on what was believed to be the local German command post when he was fatally wounded. His loss was a devastating blow, not only to the morale of the Norwegian contingent, but to the operation as a whole. Linge was more than a soldier. He was a symbol of his nation's defiance. His courage in the face of overwhelming odds would be remembered, and in time, the Norwegian Independent Company would carry his name into legend. Yet even amid these grim realities, the Allied forces pressed on. The commandos, undeterred by mounting casualties and fierce resistance, systematically cleared enemy positions. They blew up fuel dumps, destroyed communications equipment, and neutralized gun emplacements. They found and demolished the fish oil factories, the primary industrial targets, dealing a serious blow to German munitions production. As the day wore on, it became clear that the objectives had been achieved, albeit at greater cost than anticipated. Operation Archery had turned into a battle far more violent than planned, but the commandos proved equal to the task. Their discipline held, their training paid off. And when the time came to withdraw under cover of Royal Navy guns and RAF aircraft, they did so in good order, taking with them prisoners, intelligence documents, and the pride of a mission accomplished under fire. As the smoke cleared from the burning streets of Måløy and the echoes of rifle and machine gun fire faded into the icy December air, the true cost and consequence of Operation Archery began to reveal themselves, not only in the lives lost and equipment expended, but in the profound strategic shifts it triggered across the entire European theater. The operation, though relatively small in scale compared to the titanic battles being waged in North Africa and the Soviet Union, was a masterstroke of audacity, precision, and consequence. In total, the daring raid on Norway's rugged coast came at a steep price for the British and their Norwegian allies. 17 British commandos, the elite tip of the Allied spear, were killed in the brutal house-to-house fighting that defined the raid. These were not nameless soldiers. They were seasoned volunteers, many of whom had seen combat before, trained rigorously in the unforgiving Scottish Highlands, and deeply committed to their mission. Their loss resonated deeply within the close-knit commando units, where camaraderie was forged under extreme conditions, and every man was known to his comrades not just by name, but by character. An additional 53 commandos were wounded during the operation, many of them in close combat engagements in the narrow streets of Måløy. Some sustained life-altering injuries, shrapnel wounds, gunshots, frostbite, and burns from demolitions. These men were evacuated under heavy fire. Their injuries tended to aboard the Royal Navy vessels waiting just offshore. The discipline and professionalism of the medical teams aboard these ships and of their fellow commandos under fire ensured that as many lives as possible were saved. The Royal Navy, too, paid its price. 4 sailors lost their lives during the supporting naval bombardments and the operation's hazardous close-in maneuvers. 4 others were wounded, many during the intense return fire from shore batteries or small arms fire that raked the decks of their destroyers as they approached the coast. One of the warships, the light cruiser HMS Kenya, suffered light damage during the engagement, likely from German coastal artillery or a lucky strike from small arms fire as she maneuvered to deliver suppressing fire. Despite the risk, these vessels remained on station, providing constant covering fire that undoubtedly saved the lives of many commandos pinned down by enemy resistance in the town. The Royal Air Force, operating in adverse winter conditions over mountainous terrain and deep fjords, also suffered notable losses. 8 aircraft were lost during the course of the operation, several likely downed by German anti-aircraft fire, others possibly by mechanical failure or mid-air mishap in the unforgiving skies over Norway. The RAF's contribution was critical. Their precision strikes disrupted enemy communications, neutralized anti-aircraft positions, and prevented German reinforcements from mounting a coordinated counterattack. Though the loss of these aircraft and their crews was keenly felt, the role they played in the success of the operation was beyond dispute. On the German side, the losses were considerably heavier. At least 120 German soldiers were killed during the raid, many of them members of the elite Gebirgsjäger unit who had engaged the British commandos in vicious close-quarters fighting. These mountain troops, veterans of the Eastern Front, fought with characteristic tenacity, but the shock and ferocity of the commando assault ultimately overwhelmed them. Another 98 German soldiers were captured, many surrendering after their positions were overrun or isolated. Among the prisoners were officers and communications specialists, some of whom held valuable intelligence that would be carefully extracted in the days and weeks to follow. Perhaps the most significant material gain of the entire operation, however, came not in the form of prisoners or destroyed infrastructure, but in the realm of intelligence. Among the documents seized by the commandos during the raid was a complete copy of the German Naval Code, an unexpected and extraordinary coup for Allied cryptographers. This codebook, quickly transferred to British intelligence upon the commandos' return, provided vital insight into the operational communications of the Kriegsmarine. It was a windfall for Bletchley Park, where the tireless work of British codebreakers, most famously Alan Turing and his team, was already underway. The capture of this codebook would aid in decrypting German naval transmissions, enhancing the effectiveness of the Battle of the Atlantic campaign, and saving countless Allied lives in the long run. The reverberations of Operation Archery extended far beyond the rocky shores of Vogtsøy. Adolf Hitler, alarmed by the audacity and effectiveness of the raid, was convinced that it signaled the opening of a broader Allied invasion of Norway. Though no such campaign was in the works at that time, Hitler's response was swift and decisive. He ordered the immediate reinforcement of Norway, transferring a staggering 30,000 troops to bolster the region's defenses. Coastal batteries were strengthened, anti-aircraft installations expanded, and garrisons up and down the length of the Norwegian coast were put on high alert. Concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and artillery positions were rapidly constructed, and resources were diverted to maintain a high state of readiness in a theater that had been, up to that point, largely considered secure. This massive reallocation of German troops and materials had strategic consequences elsewhere. Every soldier, artillery piece, and supply train sent to fortify Norway was one less available to the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht was already stretched to the breaking point in the face of the Soviet winter counteroffensive. The timing could not have been worse for Hitler. The Soviet Union, reeling from the initial phases of Operation Barbarossa, was beginning to regain its footing. The relief provided by Hitler's overreaction to Operation Archery contributed, albeit indirectly, to the broader strategic shift that would see the tide of war begin to turn in the East. Furthermore, Operation Archery stood as a textbook example of the effectiveness of combined arms warfare. It was a seamless integration of air, sea, and land forces in a tightly choreographed operation. Each element supported and enhanced the other. The RAF cleared the skies and softened up defenses. The Royal Navy delivered the troops and provided bombardment. The commandos executed the ground assault with surgical precision. This coordination would become the standard for future Allied operations, from the Dieppe raid to the Normandy landings. In the years that followed, Operation Archery would be studied by military planners as a case study in small-scale amphibious warfare. It demonstrated the power of agility, surprise, and coordination over brute force. And for the men who took part, many of whom would go on to fight in even bloodier battles, it was a defining moment, proof that even a small, well-led force could shake the confidence of the Nazi war machine. Operation Archery, in its scope, its execution, and its consequences, was far more than a raid. It was a message, a statement to the world that the Allies could strike where they pleased, when they pleased, and that no corner of occupied Europe was beyond reach. For the people of Norway, it was a spark of hope. For the men of the commandos, it was a test of steel, and for the German High Command, it was a rude awakening that their Atlantic wall was not as impenetrable as they believed. Operation Archery stands as a stirring testament to the extraordinary courage, determination, and ingenuity of the Allied forces during the darkest days of the Second World War. Launched during the bleak winter of 1941, when much of Europe remained under the iron grip of Nazi occupation and the Axis tide seemed nearly unstoppable, this audacious raid on the small Norwegian town of Måløy represented more than a military maneuver. It was a defiant gesture of resistance, an act of transnational solidarity, and a spark of hope for a continent yearning to be free. The men who took part in the operation were not ordinary soldiers. They were commandos, volunteers drawn from the British Army and specialized units across the Commonwealth. Men trained for daring amphibious assaults, sabotage, and rapid strikes behind enemy lines. Among them were members of number. 3 Commando supported by elite detachments from numbers, 2, 4, and 6 Commandos, and significantly the Norwegian Independent Company 1, led by the charismatic and fearless Captain Martin Linge. These were warriors forged not just through training, but by a shared sense of purpose, an understanding that their actions carried weight far beyond the battlefield. The challenges they faced were immense. Not only did they land on a heavily defended coastline amid the icy, treacherous waters of the North Sea, but they did so during the dead of winter, under threat from hidden German artillery positions and veteran troops on leave from the brutal Eastern Front. The weather was unforgiving. The terrain was unfamiliar, and yet the men pressed on. In the face of fierce resistance, including intense street fighting in Måløy itself, where every building became a potential fortress, they fought with discipline and ferocity, systematically overcoming enemy strongpoints and achieving their objectives under the most hazardous conditions. It was not just a tactical victory. Operation Archery proved beyond doubt that small, well-coordinated elite forces could strike with precision and cause disproportionate disruption to the enemy. It validated the British strategy of employing commandos for lightning raids, striking at the vulnerable edges of Hitler's fortress Europe. The seamless cooperation between the ground troops, the Royal Navy providing naval bombardments and transport, and the Royal Air Force flying dangerous close air support missions over the fjords, demonstrated the effectiveness of integrated, combined arms warfare, a method that would be refined and scaled up in later campaigns, including the invasions of Sicily and Normandy. Importantly, this operation was also a powerful symbol of international unity. The inclusion of Norwegian troops operating under the flag of a government in exile, fighting to liberate their own soil, highlighted the shared commitment of occupied nations and their allies. The death of Captain Martin Linge, though a tragic loss, underscored the sacrifice and courage of those who refused to yield to tyranny. His leadership and bravery were emblematic of the Norwegian spirit of resistance, and his memory became a rallying cry for freedom fighters across the country. For the people of Norway, the impact of Operation Archery extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. It served as a bold reminder that they had not been forgotten, that their struggle against Nazi occupation was seen, acknowledged, and supported by the outside world. News of the raid quickly spread through underground channels, sparking renewed resolve among resistance fighters and civilians alike. In homes where radios were hidden beneath floorboards, in dimly lit basements where leaflets were printed in secret, and in the hushed conversations of those who still dared to hope, the message was clear. The Allies could strike back, and liberation was not a distant dream. Operation Archery also forced the Nazi High Command to reassess its assumptions. Hitler, ever paranoid and reactive, interpreted the raid as a possible prelude to a full-scale invasion of Norway. In response, he ordered vast reinforcements to the region, pulling tens of thousands of troops and resources from other critical fronts, including the already strained Eastern Front, where German forces were beginning to falter against a resurgent Soviet counteroffensive. In this way, the raid achieved a strategic impact far beyond its immediate scope. It tied down enemy forces, diverted attention, and helped ease pressure on other Allied efforts, particularly in Russia and the Atlantic. In the annals of military history, Operation Archery occupies a special place not because of its scale, but because of what it represented. It was proof that targeted tactical strikes could have wide-ranging consequences. It showed that Allied forces, though facing daunting odds and spread across multiple fronts, could still mount bold operations that struck fear into the hearts of the occupiers. It demonstrated that cooperation between nations, Britain and Norway in this case, was not only possible, but essential in the struggle against totalitarianism. Perhaps most poignantly, Operation Archery left behind a legacy of bravery that continues to inspire generations. The men who stormed the shores of Vågsøy, who fought house to house in Måløy, and who gave their lives far from home in service of a greater cause, are remembered not just as soldiers, but as heroes. Their story is one of conviction and courage in the face of adversity, a narrative that resonates especially with those who lived through the war or whose families bore the scars of its upheaval. For veterans and those who recall the Second World War with personal memories, either of service, sacrifice, or survival, Operation Archery is a reminder of what can be accomplished when good people stand together against tyranny. It exemplifies the moral clarity and unity of purpose that defined the Allied effort and affirms the enduring truth that freedom, though often hard-won, is always worth fighting for.